In this part, we'll create a mockup for some of the forms, starting with the login process. We'll start with the login form. Since the Uber app is portrait locked, it should be pretty easy to reproduce this UI. However, we'll first start with one element, and that's the country button. The reason it's logistically separate is that it has some non-trivial logic and resides in two separate forms. So it makes sense to define it in a single generic class. The country code picker is a button subclass, but it doesn't really look like it because we set the UI ID to the country code picker UI ID. In this block of code, we try to guess the current country based on the localization settings. The flags.res file is included in the SMS activation cn1lib. It's a bit of an implementation detail, so this code might break in the future. If so, we might need to copy the res file from there or update the code. We don't have all the flags for all the countries. Without a blank icon, the alignment might seem broken, so it's crucial to have this. Show picker form is useful for overriding. In the login form, clicking this button should lead to a different form. However, there is a lot more going on here. The cover transition collides with the default slide transition, producing a weird effect. So here we keep the transition instance. Remove the out transition so the cover effect will work properly. We then bind a show listener that restores the old transition after we are done. That's important for when the user will click to move to the next form. The styling for country code picker are pretty simple. It's black on transparent background. The padding is big on the left but small on the right, so the text element stays near the button. Margin is again 0. And the font is pretty standard, light 3mm font. So without further ado, let's go to the login form code. This is the code of the first form you will see when the Uber app launches. It's a relatively simple class without too many frills. Let's go over a few elements of note. Initially, I wrote the word Uber. Without the right font, it looked weird. Using an image for a logo is generally the best approach. I want the logo to be square, so height and width should be identical. We place the entire tiled section and logo in the center of the form, so they will take up the available space. We place the logo itself in the absolute center, so it will float in the middle. I override the behavior of the country picker button for consistency with the native Uber app. This looks like a text field, but acts like a button in the native app, so I implemented it as such. Considering the rows and size is important for proper layout. The rest of the UI is relegated to the south of the form. This would have issues in landscape mode, but since the app is portrait locked, this shouldn't be a problem. We need these two images to complete the form UI, the tile PNG and Uber logo.png. There are a few styles we need to define in order to finish this form. The square logo UI ID is used for the logo. I still have the foreground defined as this used to be text and not an image. The main thing here are the white opaque background. We use some white padding on the logo, but we don't need margin. The logo background style represents the pattern tile in behind the logo. This is pretty easy to accomplish. Once we have the tile.png file, we can style it to tile on both axes. We set the transparency to 255 as the image is opaque, and we want to make sure this is totally opaque. We define the margin to 0 as usual. Notice we ignore padding as it just doesn't matter for this component. The Get Moving with Uber UI ID just sets the padding to a right size, so it's spaced enough from the sides but close enough to the element below. We don't need margin, color, or anything else because we derive from label. The main reason for this UI ID is the large dominating 4.8mm font size. The phone number hint represents the text that looks like a hint next to the flag. When we move to the next form, it actually becomes the real hint text. It's gray with no background. It has 0 padding on the left to keep it close to the country picker button. The font is 3.7mm, which looked right after some trial and error. The separator UI ID is a container which has an underline below it. As a container, we define it as completely transparent. It has a 2-pixel bottom padding to leave space for the underline. The margin is 0 as usual. The border is an underline 2-pixel border in a gray color. The Connect with Social button is the button at the bottom of the UI. It looks like a label, but has a bluish color. I need to define the padding even though it should be derived from label, as deriving from built-in types isn't always 100% reliable. I could have worked around it by defining a MyLabel UI ID and deriving from that. I still chose to derive from label, which mostly works. But I defined the font just to be on the safe side. This is the UI we've made next to the native Uber UI. You will notice some minor differences, mostly with fonts not being pixel perfect. I didn't aim for perfection with fonts, as that can be endless. There are some other nuances I'll go into.